This is the second in a two-part series on the Adoration of the Magi by the Master of Sigena by our curator here at the museum, Amanda Dotseth. Amanda Dotseth completed her PhD in medieval art and architecture at the Courtauld Institute of Art and has held fellowships from the Fulbright Association, the Mellon Foundation, and the Spanish National Research Council. Currently, she's an associated scholar in the project, The Medieval Iberian Treasury in Context, Collections, Connections, and Representations on the Peninsula and Beyond, and a short-term collaborator on the ERC-funded project, Petrifying Wealth, the Southern European Shift to Masonry as Collective Investment in Identity, circa 1050 to 1300. She's contributed to a number of exhibitions here at the Meadows, including Fernando Gallego and his workshop, the Altarpiece from Ciudad Rodrigo, Zurbaran, Jacob and his 12 sons, and El Greco Goya and a Taste for Spain, highlights from the Meadows Museum. Some upcoming projects include Canvas and Silk, Historic Fashion from Madrid's Museo del Traje, The Art of Medieval Pilgrimage in Spain, and an edited volume published by Breppels called Collective Display, Medieval Art Out of Isolation, which is forthcoming. So with that, it's my pleasure to welcome and turn the presentation over to Dr. Amanda Dotseth.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne. I really am delighted to see you all here for round two of our lecture series on 6 centuries in the life of an altarpiece. It strikes me that these really, really large commissions that are so multifaceted and have so many different pieces, often the afterlife of the object after it's removed is as fascinating as the making of the object itself. So we will pick up where we left off last time, which was about in the 16th century, but just as a reminder, and because I love, as you've noticed, Sancha of Castile, I thought I'd remind you all that our last lecture dealt with everything that happened at the monastery of Sikhana that made it possible for this wonderful altarpiece to be created in the 16th century. So we had to go kind of back in time to the foundation of the monastery in 1188. So, and the themes that I kind of brought up last time, I think hold true throughout the rest of this altarpieces and this monastery's life, in the sense that memory is very important to the community at Sikhana, to the nuns who are living there. They are very much aware of their origins, of the royal foundation in the 12th century. And of course, the queen is still buried there. So, and they're still saying mass in her honor. So even though it seems like, okay, what happened back in the 12th century might not matter so much in the 16th, I would argue it very much mattered to the community at Sikhana to remember their origins. And we'll see more examples of that as I go along. So of course, here is just a reminder of this wonderful panel. And I'd like to start by the way I started when this acquisition presented itself to us, which is you start in some ways by asking what the object can tell us. So again, this is just a reminder of the full object we're looking at. So we have our wonderful panel on the left, but this is a hypothetical reconstruction of what the entire high altarpiece or retablo mayor may have looked like. So I kind of go back and forth. When I talk about the artwork, I mean the whole group in terms of the altarpiece, but also this panel in particular. And then again, just to remind you of the kind of amazing opulence these objects would have had. That sad little reconstruction doesn't really do it justice. So I wanted to give you a sense of what an altarpiece from the same time period looks like in situ. Look at all that gold and all the gilding on those frames and how colorful, and the sculpture of the Virgin. So just try and imagine this altarpiece I'm showing you here is actually quite a bit smaller than the one that our painting would have been a part of. So, but I want you to just keep in mind just how grand and amazing these objects were. Again, sad reconstruction, but you can get a sense of what a big commission this was. So what can this object tell us about itself? This is always where I start, and this was an excuse for me to put up this absolutely amazing detail of what is probably would have been a leather embroidered bag. So some wonderful fashion in this that is the subject of maybe another lecture. But when we start with what does this object tell us about itself? I mean that very literally in a lot of ways. Just by looking at it, looking at the back, what is it made of? What can we learn from it? So what I start doing, of course, is I start really just looking carefully, like what do these figures look like? What do the colors look like? Um, you know, a gallery will tell you what they think it is, and we as curators and scholars have to decide if we agree with them. And one of the ways we do this is through an exercise of connoisseurship. So of course, just looking very carefully at how figures are painted. We, in this case, also were very lucky that the gallery had done a full conservation report. So we had, this is a detail of an infrared reflectogram mosaic. So this is just using infrared light to look beyond the painted surface to see the underdrawing underneath. And I hope you can see, I brought some details, so we'll look. All of this, which would have been a carbon black pigment on a brush that was used to mark out the composition on the white ground before paint was applied. So what we see here is, and what does this tell us? This tells us that the artist was a great draftsman, and it also gives us yet another thing to compare to other extant works that are attributed to this artist, who of course at the time was known only as the Master of Sigena. He's only known because he happened to work at this really important monastery, right? So I hope you can just appreciate how absolutely exquisite this drawing is. You can see it's just very finely applied, but very detailed, this hatching and then cross hatching to indicate light and shadow, even before he and his workshop started painting. This I just wanted to show you again. The gallery had conducted some x-rays as well of the panel, x-radiographs. You can see here these bars are from a modern cradle. They're incredibly distracting, but there's still information to be gleaned from this. And this is another tool we use to find out more about the artist's technique. And again, gives us another point of comparison. So usually what we're looking for in an X-ray like this are things like incisions might show up. So if the artist used a compass to make a perfect circle, that sort of thing. So we're looking at all of these things. And of course, we compare to works that are more firmly attributed. And in this case, this is a panel from the Prado. This is in their collection. This is the Nativity. And they also had conducted infrared reflectography on their panel. So I was able to compare not only the panel itself, and I did see it in person, with images of these kind of faces that have these little kind of bulby noses and the kind of wrinkles around their mouths, and just the ways the eyes are kind of deep set and painted. So you can make all these comparisons. And then you can also, of course, compare the underdrawing. So here I just have two slides. On the left, you see the Christ child from our Adoration of the Magi. And then on the right, a detail of some of this lovely, again, this very fine hatching in the underdrawing. So these are things that we do to compare to say, okay, this is what the object is telling us about itself, that it is indeed something created in the 16th century by an artist who is extremely competent and very confident, who had been formally trained as a draftsman and painter. And then based on the size of the commission, we know there would have been a very large workshop involved to complete it. So then I started looking for other panels, and this is the classic case of, unlike, for example, those of you who remember the Gallego project, that altarpiece, the paintings that survive are pretty much all in one place. There may be one or two that could have been a part of it, but all the 24 or 26, I can't remember, that are now in Arizona are together. In this case, very early on, panels went kind of everywhere. So we have panels, in this case, we're looking at, there are a number in the Provincial Museum of Huesca. Remember that the monastery of Sikhana is in the province of Huesca. And what we're seeing here is not just a kind of stylistic affinity between all of the panels that tell us they would have created a kind of a homogeneous whole. Like, again, if we think about the retablo as a whole work of art, but we're also seeing all these wonderful scenes from the life of the Virgin. So we're getting a sense of what the actual subject matter of the altarpiece was. It's not uncommon to have a kind of life of Christ and life of the Virgin. But of course, it, makes sense, perhaps, particularly in a female monastery, to have so many wonderful scenes from the life of the Virgin. So we have the Virgin's birth on the left, and then the visitation. Of course, this is the moment when the Virgin Mary meets Elizabeth, and Elizabeth is pregnant with John the Baptist, and Mary's pregnant with the Christ child, and they leap in the mother's wombs when they embrace here. So that's what we're looking at on the left. Two more panels. Again, these are from Huesca. We have Annunciation on the right, and on the left is the embrace at the Golden Gate. So this is the moment of Mary's conception. This is before the kind of classic iconography of the Immaculate Conception is codified. So before you get these images like our grand Murillo that's on our staircase, this is like, Immaculate Conception, we're very familiar. Before that iconography was developed, if you're trying to show the conception of Mary, it was usually done this way, with Joachim and Anne embracing, and at that moment, Mary is conceived without sin. So back to our painting. So then we start looking closely again at our painting and say, okay, we know what the materials can tell us. We know what connoisseurship can tell us. What else can we learn from this? And of course, one of the striking things about this painting is this very central figure here. I hate to say it, but poor Mary and the Christ child and Joseph are kind of relegated to the side of the composition. So we have this very striking figure in the center. He's the only magus who's still wearing his crown. The other two have already taken their crown off in honor of the Christ child. One has already given his gift to the Christ child. That's why he's holding that coin there for gold. And then there's this very prominent bandgrol flag thing just above this central magus's head. And it has a very clear piece of iconography on it, a piece of heraldry, really, which we know to be quite famously the symbol of the Holy Roman Emperor. So then we start thinking, okay, this guy's hairstyle is very much in keeping with a 16th century hairstyle, unlike the other two characters we have here, which are kind of much more, generic, beard, so we know he's older, that sort of thing. But in this case, we have light hair and a very specific hairstyle, right? So then we start thinking, okay, well, and he's under this double-headed eagle that's the symbol of the Holy Roman Empire. So we start to ask ourselves, okay, could this be the Holy Roman Emperor? Is it trying to look like him? And so then we look for, yet again, other examples of this. Are there any other examples of, this figure, this Holy Roman Emperor type person being inserted into a religious painting? And I came across this one, which is actually Italian, but it's similarly an Adoration of the Magi, and it similarly has someone who looks suspiciously like the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. And this painting dates to almost the same moment. So when I keep saying Holy Roman Emperor, of course, who am I talking about? I'm talking about Charles I of Spain, who would be crowned Holy Roman Emperor later. So Charles I is his title in Spain. Charles V is his title as Holy Roman Emperor, and he's crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, which is why we partly date this painting to around 1519. Again, this is all what we're getting by what the object can tell us itself. I haven't gotten into documentation yet, so we'll get into that in a little bit. But this is just the way our thinking works. Of course, then I start thinking, who's this little fellow who also has a 16th century haircut and light hair? So we'll get into that later. but these are just the primary questions I'm asking at this point. So here we go again. We just have the person that we are suggesting is potentially Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, painted right around the time he's crowned Holy Roman Emperor. And then this other figure that I will propose is Charles V's brother, Ferdinand of Aragon. So we'll get to that in a minute. So let's just talk about some background history. These are actual portraits of Charles I, King of Spain, or Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. So I hope you can see what I mean in terms of that kind of lighter hair, cropped haircut. The artist has, you know, obviously, I'm not arguing this is a portrait. Let's go with idealized likeness or something like that. But I think there's enough evidence there to suggest it very well could be. And then, of course, if this is the Charles V's emperor's brother, Ferdinand, then that would be this character here. Again, an actual portrait. So the background, who are these people? Well, we've all probably heard of Isabella of Castile and Fernando II of, I love this. I wrote Ferdinando. I don't know if I'm in English or Spanish here. So Ferdinand, let's say, if we're going to use the English pronunciation, Ferdinand II of Aragon, who of course very famously were granted the moniker the Catholic Kings for their defense of the Catholic faith, and in their marriage joined the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, making Spain is the borders of Spain on the Iberian Peninsula, more or less what they are today. So we're starting with these two. They have this wonderful little child in this absolutely stunning portrait by Michael Sitow, by the way, who's called Juana. And of course, we'll all have heard of her as Juana la Loca or Joanna the Crazy. That's a whole different story that I won't get into here. But she gets married to this fellow here, Philip, who's known as Philip the Fair or Philip the Handsome. He was known for being very handsome. Not that I can say he looks it so much in this photo or in this portrait, but he's the Duke of Burgundy and King of Castile. So the key to this is that he's in Burgundy. Juana goes to live with him in Burgundy. That's where they give birth to Charles, and Charles, who would go on to inherit the kingdom of Spain. When Isabella the Catholic died, however, she didn't leave Castile to her husband, Ferdinand. She left it to her daughter, Juana. So Juana was Queen of Castile in her own right. And the reason that this was sort of seen as okay is they thought Philip was going to help her out and be King of Castile, right? Unfortunately, he dies in 1506. So shortly after, you'll see Isabella dies in 1504, so she leaves her kingdom to her daughter. Ferdinand, the husband, is still hanging out in Aragon. He still has his territories there, as well as the ones in Italy. And they're supposed to be ruling Castile together, but unfortunately, he quite famously dies en route, so while they're traveling through Castile. So now you have this conundrum where you have a woman who's been deemed incompetent, right? Because she's supposedly gone crazy from her husband's death and his philandering and all this stuff. So they kind of tuck her away in a convent. And then we have her father, Ferdinand and Aragon, still alive, and her son, Charles V, who's still up in Burgundy, or Charles I at this point, still up in Burgundy. And so this creates a really difficult dynamic. Again, she lives till 1555, so she's alive during all of this, but she's tucked away in Tordesillas and sort of living in a very carefully constructed world where she's not being involved in the politics. So Charles was born in Burgundy. He spoke French. He didn't speak Castilian. His Latin wasn't very great, apparently. He gets better at these things later, but after Philip dies, and he basically becomes the de facto ruler of Castile because of this idea that poor Juana can't do it. So he's very much Burgundian. His brother, on the other hand, who you see on the right, was actually born in Spain when Juana was there. And so he learned Spanish and was brought up in the Spanish court with his father. And of course or with his grandfather, excuse me. So he's named after his grandfather, Ferdinand II. And so what we have here is the guy on the left who inherits Castile, but he's still seen as a consort. People are suspicious of him because he's from Burgundy. And when he finally gets to Spain in 1517, nobody really nobody knows him. He doesn't speak Spanish well. He feels like an outsider to people, but his brother has been there the whole time. So what you get in the politics of this moment is Charles going around Spain in 15, 17, 16, 18, right around then, and he's trying to get support from the groups of nobles that have a lot of power in Castile and Aragon. So he does a kind of charm tour, right? And he's dealing with the fact that his brother is kind of the native son, the one that people are kind of more comfortable with, particularly in Aragon. And just a reminder, we're fast forwarding at the time that Charles V abdicated, this is what his empire looked like. And keep in mind, this doesn't include the Americas. So you can see this guy has control over, a good chunk of Europe here, between what he's inherited from his Habsburg relatives through his father, and then what he's inherited, of course, through his mother here in Spain. And then through his grandfather, of course, he has these kingdoms in Naples, Sardinia, Sicily, these Italian properties, right? So what Charles does when he discovers that his brother is kind of feels more like the heir apparent and is more popular is he said, why don't you go rule Bohemia? So he sends his brother out to rule Bohemia. And this is all happening again right at the moment this altarpiece is being commissioned. So I think you have this kind of really fascinating dynamic where Charles is trying to consolidate his empire. He's trying to consolidate his power in Spain. He recognizes his brother is the one that everybody sort of is more comfortable with, and are very sad. I mean, we have documents telling how the court is sad when Charles sends his brother Ferdinand off to Bohemia to rule in his name. And the Cortes in Aragon, quite fascinatingly, won't even address Charles V as king yet, because they say, well, you're not king, your mother's still alive. So there's this fascinating tension there. And I think that when we think of this painting now again, in that kind of rich kind of political context, you can say, okay, here we have some ladies at a very powerful royal monastery in Sikhana, that's sort of in the heart of Aragon. As I mentioned last week, there's these crossroads, it's on this point of crossroads between some of Aragon's most important cities. We can, thanks to the documentation, we can put Charles V in Zaragoza right around this time, so 15, 17, 18. And so we know he's there. And so I just can't help but think that these very powerful, these women from very powerful noble families who knew who would have known Charles V was in Zaragoza. And here they are, and we'll get into this more a little bit later, but here they are thinking, okay, we're commissioning a major artwork. And history is being made right next door. So in a way, they're, I think, expressing allegiance to not just Charles V, but maybe also his brother Ferdinand, who's the little guy here. They look quite young. They were quite young. Charles V was born in 1500, so he's only a teenager while all this is going on. A very competent one, don't get me wrong, but a teenager. His brother's 3 years younger, so I think it's appropriate that they look quite young. And I think it's a really interesting way to think about how you can manipulate a religious scene or religious art to also kind of advance political ends. And in this case, I think not so subtly, right? Charles V is very clearly in the center of the composition, very clearly under this heraldry. Again, he was crowned in 1519. So this is right around this when this is being painted. But oh, don't forget Ferdinand as well. He's, you know, he's also here. So I feel like the nuns are being very, very kind of pragmatic in showing their support, and in so doing their family support, because again, these are very powerful, noble women. So this is where we get into the fun part of documentation and where the documents can really help. Last week, I spoke quite a bit about the importance of Sikhena's archive and how that would have had an impact on the kind of memory of the nuns there, because you think not only do they have the tombs of the founding prioress, of previous members of the community, but they also have all their documents. So they have stuff that Sancha wrote herself or had written and signed. So they know this kind of, they're very aware of the legacy of where they are. So this wonderful, interesting human being, Maria de Urrea, who is the prioress of Sikhana between 1510 and 1521. We don't really know a lot about her except for the documents that were preserved in the archive of Sikhana. And one thing that we do know is that through inheritance, and it's kind of a funny story because she was sort of the last person who was supposed to inherit her father's not title, but the lands associated with the title, this like county of Biota. So all these other people die, unfortunately, and she ends up coming into a substantial inheritance in the form of this land, which she sells in 1514. So again, this is before Charles I would have even arrived in Iberia. But she sells all of this, and she's very clear in her documents, in the documents at Sikhana, what she wants to do with it. So she, whoops, what did I do? Where am I? Here. So she specifically states she wants to use this inheritance to update and commission artworks for the monastery. So this is her personal money, her personal inheritance. Of course, she doesn't have any kids because she's a nun. So, you know, she's giving it to her institution. So then we have documents that state there are artists, in fact, at Sikhana, and one of them is named as Rodrigo of Sajonia, or Roderick of Saxony. So we know that there is this German artist or Saxon artist working in Sikhana at the time. Luckily, the technical analysis has told us there's a particular chemical in the ground layer that was typically used in Germany, not in Spain. So we already had this idea that maybe the artist was coming from somewhere else and coming from Germany. So basically finding the name Roderick of Saxony in the documents are why we were able to change the attribution. So she states her intentions in 1514. We have documents saying there are artists there working, and then she dies in 1521 and leaves her last will and testament, and specifically states that her family's been associated with the monastery since the 12th century. So again, very aware of this legacy, right? And the kind of longue durée of this institution and her role in it. And then asked to be buried next to her ancestor, Teresa de Urrea, who died in 1321. So we're 3 centuries later, and she still wants to be close to this relative. So there's a kind of major sense, again, of the history of the place. She's succeeded by another prioress, Beatrice, Orcinegas, and she kind of finishes all the jobs that Maria started in terms of artworks. So who is Maria de Urrea? We don't really actually know much about her. I'd love to do some further archival research once we can travel again, but for now, we at least know that she was the daughter of this Viscount of Biota and the Señor de Sestrica. So we know that she's the daughter of this powerful nobleman. She was also a legitimate daughter This is important because it comes up a lot in the documents. She's the sister of another Jimeno, who was also, he was the last Viscount of that area, because of course, after he dies, when he dies, this is when she gets the inheritance in 1514. And then she has another brother who is an illegitimate brother, whose name is Jerónimo de Urrea, who is a kind of, he's probably the best known from the family in this time period. He's got a Wikipedia page, for example, but he was a poet, translator, he wrote prose, so there's a lot of his extant works that survive. But what's interesting to me is that he was very devoted to Charles V and participated in a number of his battles. So I think that in that case, we have a very direct connection between the Urrea family and Charles V. And so thinking of Maria putting her, honoring Charles V in her altarpiece, it all ties in together very well. And if you remember last week, the nuns would have remembered the bad things that happen if you're not supporting the right royal in a schism. They were punished essentially, and there hadn't been an actual royal heiress in the monastery really since then. Now we're back to mostly noble women. But in this case, it's not only are they, I think, supportive because of the family relations and just prudence, but they're being very public about their support, I think, of Charles V. And of course, in her will, what's wonderful is we know she didn't just commission 2 retablos, so the retablo mayor, whence comes our painting, but she also commissioned a smaller retablo that was for, was it in the refectory? No, I can't remember. But anyways, a smaller one from the same artist and workshop. But she also donated vestments and an organ, and she paid off all the monastery's debts, which is a really big deal. So she's really kind of this pivotal character that, because she came into this great inheritance, was really able to update and advance and preserve the monastery. So she's kind of, for me, the like new Sancha in a way, the 16th century version of the foundress. So now what happens to the altarpiece after Maria and Beatrice? So we have spent all this time thinking about the commissions and what's happening, particularly in the 2nd and 3rd decades of the 16th century. Well, things get a little fuzzy from here, and part of the reason for that is just there's less documentation, curiously enough, or there is, and nobody's gone through it or found it yet. So I should note that the documentation associated with Maria was, we had an idea of some of this because there was a 17th century chronicler who told us that Maria de Urrea had commissioned this altarpiece. But you never know how much you can trust someone coming 100 years later, right? He supposedly had access to the documents. Well, then the documents kind of went missing and nobody really knew where they were. And they were only recently discovered in the museum, the Manac in Barcelona. And it's there that researchers were able to consult the original documents and publish them. And this is like hot off the press. I mean, this only happened, I think, a few months ago, which is why we only recently changed the attribution to Rodrigo of Sajonia. So this is all very new, and there's still a lot of new things to be discovered, of course. But apart from that, you know, we have a pretty big gap here in the timeline. But we know that the retablo mayor was dismantled in the 18th century. This is not uncommon at all. It was fairly common, particularly around the 17th and 18th century, to take down artworks that were seen now as out of date. You know, artistic styles change, tastes change. They may have been looking for something kind of more sculptural or whatever, but they take it down in the 18th century. And at that point, so it's dismantled, it's already in kind of loose pieces, but it's still in the monastery. So the panels are still installed somewhere. We don't have a lot of information about where. You know, were they stacked up in a closet? I don't know. The Gallego panels were stored in the cloister. So, you know, that it could have just been installed somewhere else. Fast forward to the 19th century, we know that the monastery was part of this large campaign to nationalize church properties right around the 1830s, 30s and 40s. This is known in Spanish as the desamortización, and it was instigated by an economist and politician named Mendizábal. This is a moment in Spanish history, this kind of, first half of the 19th century, where the government's changing kind of frequently between a republican state and a monarchy. There's a lot of kind of political unrest, but there's also a kind of dire need for just money for the Spanish state, which was in great debt. And so one way they thought of kind of handling this was to nationalize these church properties and sell them. And in many cases, they weren't necessarily thinking about the buildings and the paintings and things like that. They were thinking about the land, because that's what they could get, real money for. It's at this moment that, however, that a lot of these monasteries are abandoned because they've been cut off. So essentially, it's like the Spanish government sells the land of the monastery, but the land of the monastery is what the inhabitants depended upon for revenue, right? So that they could eat and things like that. So they abandoned the monastery, although apparently a few kind of hung around still. And I should note that since the very beginning, the monastery wasn't very strict with enclosure. I mentioned this last week. It was kind of more of a suggestion than a rule. So the nuns never really lived there full time. They came for certain periods of time, and then they could go back to their properties, their own properties as well. Part of this reason was because, they were noble women and maybe they didn't want to have to be there the whole time. But the main excuse that always gets given is, if you remember from last week, this they had to drain a swamp to build this monastery. So the documents often cite that because this is such a swampy area, you'd get sick if you just stayed there too long. So this is often the excuse used to break enclosure, basically, and be able to go home to your more comfortable situation. So we have a few kind of nuns, I guess, hanging on that maybe don't live there full time, but come there some of the time and check in on it in the 19th century. Of course, this is probably when some of the panels left. We don't know really how or why or what those circumstances were, but we do have a traveler who visits Siena in 1908, who's looking for objects for this great Exposición de Zaragoza, which was going to happen that year. So really, it's in the years leading up to 1908. He travels around looking for artworks to include in this exhibition. And he notes that the Adoration of the Magi had already been sold when he visited. So he lists all the paintings that are there, and then he lists a few that he said were already sold, and the Adoration of the Magi was one of them. Which to me, in a way, isn't super surprising. I think it's one of the most, if not the most, compelling compositions in the altarpiece. So I could see why you'd be attracted to it, and particularly if they recognized, as I'm sure they did, that there's this kind of likeness of Charles V there. I could see that being very attractive. So what this tells us is the nuns are, these are like old furniture to them in a way. They came down, hundreds of years before. This kind of memory cult has shifted clearly a little bit. Part of me thinks, wouldn't you want to keep them because of Maria? But they're also desperately cash strapped. They're dealing with the fact that they were completely dissolved as a community. And so it's not perhaps surprising that if someone came along and say, hey, can I buy that panel? They would go ahead and sell it. Maybe they need to repair the roof. So we know that our panel left by then. Many of the others left after this point. So but again, we're kind of grasping at sort of like gold dust here to kind of put together where things are and when. So then the next big moment in the monastery's life, I would say, is its destruction during the Spanish Civil War. So without going into too much detail of the war, there's two factions that are fighting, and particularly the Republican faction had issues with the Catholic Church for many, many reasons, having to do with their money, power, control over the educational system, this sort of thing. And so one of the things that happens in the Civil War is there is a kind of a very overt anti-clerical thrust, at least. And so some things get destroyed, you know, of course, by accident. There were aerial bombardments because of Franco's alliance with Nazi Germany and with Mussolini. So there's, you know, the famous Battle of Guernica and that sort of thing, which was very deliberate, but not necessarily targeting patrimony. It was targeting people. And in this case, we have the destruction, a more deliberate destruction as a kind of anti-clerical action in 1936. So what I will do, maybe if you bear with me, well, I'll send you the link later. There's a video on YouTube I'll add into the chat box that I was going to show you, but you can watch it on your own. But it's basically a photo montage of a lot of the post-war photos. So you can see that the actual damage to the monastery with, you know, roofs falling in, and this is when we know a lot of things were damaged within the structure itself. So then the monastery is restored in the 1950s. So what happens between 1936 and 1950? This is when the frescoes from the chapter house are removed, and I'll show you images of that in a second. But then the monastery is restored in the 50s, so there's still a community there, and I suspect that's when some of the photos I'll show you in a minute are from. Some may be earlier. They restored the Romanesque cloister in 1974, so we know that there's some kind of renewed interest in actually preservation of the site by the 1950s. And then now the nuns at Sikhana are no longer the order that Sancha founded. They're not the Hospitallers or the Order of St. John. It's the Sisterhood of Bethlehem who sends some nuns, and those who I believe are still in the convent now. There were still issues in the 80s, if you believe it or not, of nuns potentially selling artwork, and that's the kind of 21st century story of the altarpiece that I won't get into a lot today. But just so you know, there's throughout all of these centuries, there's still this kind of, what do you do with all this stuff, and who does it belong to? Does it belong to the nuns? Does it belong to the Catholic Church? Does it belong to the Spanish state? These are all issues that, even though they are sometimes clarified legally, are a little bit squidgy. So now the photos. This is a fun part. These are some photos before 1936, so before the destruction of the monastery at that time. And we're looking at images of the chapter house, which were filled with these very famous frescoes. I did not talk about them last week because they're actually the most famous and most published thing about this building. But they were thought to have been done by English artists, oddly enough. So keep in mind, we're a lot more cosmopolitan than it seems for this kind of middle of nowhere place in Aragon. But these stunning frescoes. So again, like I said last week, the architecture was actually quite austere in many ways and quite plain, but very soon after the building was finished, and once nuns were already occupying it, these frescoes were painted in the chapter house. So it would have been a much more lavishly decorated space. Unfortunately, however, this is an 18th century watercolor, so you can get a little bit better sense of how vibrant and light this chapter house was. The chapter house is, of course, where the community would meet to discuss all of the kind of business of the monastery. So this is where kind of decisions were made about the finances and that sort of thing. It's like the conference room, right? So you see they have this lovely, beautiful, colorful kind of chapter house that they're in. This is after the destruction of the Civil War, and you can see the frescoes are hanging in there, kind of, but all of this kind of on these transverse arches it's come right down to the plaster. These kind of stippling marks that you see are actually where they'd taken the stucco and broken it up a little so that it would hold the fresco better. So we're actually seeing below the fresco layer to the layer below that to the layer below that. So not quite stripped down to masonry, but not in very good shape, as you see. Oops, I was gonna show you, I thought I had another one. Here we go. So fairly soon after the destruction in the Civil War, the frescoes were removed, and they were, because as you can see here in this photo here, all that rubble is the ceiling having fallen in. So now these sad frescoes in the chapter house were exposed to the elements. And so it was fairly soon after that a team was able to get in and preserve the frescoes for future generations. And here's where a slightly controversial bit comes in. Once you remove these frescoes, what do you do with them? You know, the site itself is in ruins. It's not in very good shape. Nuns wouldn't come back till the 50s, so there's quite a while there. So it's decided that they will go to the National Museum of Art in Barcelona, and that's where they are now. This is how they look today in the Manac in Barcelona. Controversial because now, of course, Sikhana would, I think, really like to have them back. But it's very complicated, and partly complicated by the fact that if you follow contemporary Spanish politics, current Spanish politics, you'll know that the Catalan independence movement has gained a lot of momentum lately. And so, you know, there's a difference between Catalunya and Aragon, even though there wasn't in the 12th century, there is now. And so there's this idea that, well, if you break off into your own nation, we want our patrimony back, even though it'd be like talking about, you know, Dallas County wanting something back from Tarrant County in a way. So, but they do look really great now, but of course, completely decontextualized. I can't tell. So these I just wanted to show you. These are some photos of the nuns at Sikhana, probably after I'm trying to remember if this is after or before the Civil War. And no, I'm afraid I don't have any new information for you on these absolutely fabulous habits they're wearing, but I did reach out to a friend of mine who specializes in nuns, well, nuns in general, but also particularly on their habits. And even though she works on habits earlier that they would have worn earlier, you know, say in the Middle Ages, I'm hoping she can give me some insight into particularly this kind of headgear they have on that's so very distinctive. The rest is not so unusual, and you can see they have the cross of the Order of St. John on them, or the Order of Malta, which we talked about last week. So at least we know when they took this picture, it's still a hospitaller monastery. And I wanted to show you this as well, because this wonderful, we know this is the prioress because she's sitting in this throne. The throne and sitting in it and where everybody else had to be when she was sitting in it was very clearly stipulated by Sancha herself in the 12th century. Only the prioress could sit in that chair, and that's even when a royal king or queen was present. It's still only the prioress. So in a way, she's the queen in her own little monastery. And I wanted to show it to you because it's obvious that these thrones kind of got adapted and elaborate or updated over time, because this one is clearly, you know, it's got this like crazy little putti here. So it's clearly Baroque. But we do know of an earlier throne, and that this is it here on the left. This one dates to the, let's see, I wrote it down here. This was the throne of Blanca de Aragon y de Anjou, who is the daughter of King Jaume II of Aragon. And she was the prioress between 1321 and 1347. So this was her throne, which is now in the museum in Lerida. So again, everything from this monastery is all over the place. There's stuff in Toledo, there's stuff in Barcelona, there's stuff now in Dallas, there's stuff in Lerida as well, and in Huesca. But I just wanted to give you this sense of like this this super important piece of furniture because it played an important role in the kind of liturgical life of the church, and how it's being updated over time. So here we have frescoes being removed again. And then I thought I would just close by talking a little bit about Sikhana in the 21st century. I won't go into it a ton, but let's just say in many cases, this particular retablo has ended up in the press and in the news a lot lately. And it all started sort of with this painting. This is a painting from the same altarpiece as the same high altarpiece as our painting. This is the presentation in the temple. And so it's Mary and Joseph presenting the Christ child in the temple. And it kind of, it's interesting. It popped up on the market in Barcelona, and a reputable gallery had it for sale. And, but a few experts saw it and they thought it was a fake. They did some technical analysis on it, and that's part of what you see here on the right is an X-radiograph showing things that have been altered, essentially. And what's fascinating about, you know, it's that gray area. It's not a forgery. It is from the altarpiece, right? But it had been heavily overpainted and altered by a known forger. And the known forger made these alterations because he wanted it to look more Flemish. Because at this point in the market, and that's probably still true today, you can get more money if you say you have a Flemish panel painting than if you say you have a Hispano-Flemish panel painting or a Spanish panel painting. So this is like not forgery, but kind of forgery, not full forgery, but tweaking something to make it look like it's from somewhere else so you can get more money for it. So this, of course, as this all unfolded in the press, this was like très scandale. And in the midst of all of this, we have people in Sikhana who want their objects back. And so they were thinking, oh, well, this is a really great opportunity. This can't be sold because it has these issues for us to get back the patrimony from the monastery. So there's this, it's kind of kicks off this impulse to return patrimony to its place of origin. And again, there's a panel in the Prado, there's panels in Toledo, there's panels in Huesca, there's panels in Lerida. As far as I know, we're the only ones outside of Spain to have one of them. But it's opened this really fascinating debate about where these things should be and when they left. Anything that left after the building had been declared national patrimony, in theory, shouldn't have left. If it left before that, it's kind of like a statute of limitations. There's not really a legitimate legal claim. But I think this tied in with the Catalan independence movement and all of that has meant that it's all kind of added fervor to this argument, because if you're in Aragon and you see Catalonia trying to split from Spain, then all of a sudden your objects aren't even in Spain anymore, let alone in situ. And, you know, the arguments about can they care for it properly? Well, they now have better facilities and that sort of thing. So there's this fascinating push to return things, and it opens up a very fascinating debate about who owns patrimony, who owns, in this case, we're saying it's Spanish patrimony, but really it's world patrimony too. And, you know, what difference does it make if it's 50 miles away from where it was made? I'm not sure, but it's been an interesting thing to watch, and something that I think is a good bookend for this kind of whole history of an object that, you know, couldn't have been made without a 12th century queen exerting her power, and couldn't have been made in the way it was without, you know, another powerful woman inheriting some money, almost by accident. And then now this kind of fascinating debate about where things should live and who owns them. So I think I will conclude with that, and just again an image of our wonderful panel, and I'm happy to entertain any questions. And thank you very much for attending.
Amanda, thank you so much. That was fascinating to think about an object not as just something that tells us about the history and when it was created, but that continues to have history and play a role in politics and the economy. So we have one question already, but I would love for anyone else who has a question to go ahead and type that into the chat function. So our first question came early on when you were showing us some of the x-rays of our painting. And Barbara's wondering if there's plans to display those x-rays next to the painting at any point.
Not at this point. We don't, I was just going to pull it up again. We don't have any plans to display them at this point, partly because, unlike this one, this is the Prado's x-ray, ours are partial. So there's a little bit more than what you see here, but they didn't actually x-ray the whole panel. So I think if we were going to want to go that route and do a kind of focused installation on this painting and its technical analysis, we'd actually probably try to get Claire to redo some of this, just because, again, these are partial x-rays. Even the infrared reflectogram mosaic is partial. Like, you can see these like little cutouts here. They just didn't photograph those areas for some reason. So I think we'd go back and we'd want to have full ones done. And the infrared, I think, would definitely be interesting to display at some point, because as you can see, it's just very fine. The drawing is excellent. The x-ray is a little bit harder. Even with the Gallego project, we didn't display the x-rays, partly because they were partial, but partly because this is a modern cradle that you're seeing here, and it does make it kind of hard to see. But I think we could probably pull some really interesting details out that tell very specific stories, and it could make a really fascinating installation, just kind of a small installation just focused on this piece. We have no plans to do that right now, but I love the idea.
Thank you. We have a few more questions, but before I get to those, I do want to just kind of pause and acknowledge that I know some of you had trouble finding the link for today's Zoom, and were able to come in but missed quite a bit. So I do want to just let you know that I will be posting this lecture to the Meadows Museum YouTube channel, hopefully within the next week. So if you want to check there to kind of watch whatever you missed, or to rewatch if you were here the whole time. Okay, a few more questions. So, okay, Barbara's also interested in kind of getting some clarification about the Master of Sigena and Rodrigo de Sajonia. Are those the same people?
Yes.
Okay.
So we think. I've been kind of using them interchangeably. Here, I'll just leave this up so you're not dizzy. I've been kind of using them interchangeably. You know, we think that the Master of Sigena was Rodrigo of Sajonia because that name appears in the document. This artist had been kind of known to existed and was published for literally up until a month or so ago as the Master of Sigena. So every exhibition catalog, every art historical text referred to this person as the Master of Sigena, because all anyone knew about this person was that he worked in Sikhana. And that's where these objects came from. So it was literally just that. And so I go back and forth a lot because I'm still getting used to calling this artist Rodrigo of Sajonia. We know nothing about that artist at all. It is literally, that name is on a document that was recently discovered. And because of this technical element of a particular chemical used in the ground layer that's typical of German artists and not typical of Spanish artists, that is why that association was made. So in other words, it's like you're kind of looking for a German or a Northern European anyway, and then a document comes out that says, oh, there's a painter here called Rodrigo de Sajonia who's working at Siena and at the right time in the right place with the right commission and all of that. So do we know for 100,000% sure? No, but it's highly likely. And it's likely enough that we change the attribution. But you will notice we, on our website and elsewhere, we list it as Rodrigo de Sajonia, and then parenthetically, also known as the Master of Sigena. And that was a very deliberate choice, just because even now, people wouldn't, if they're doing an internet search or they're doing research, they wouldn't probably know to look for Rodrigo of Sajonia. They'd probably look for the Master of Sigena. So yes, they're the same person. We're mostly sure. Sure enough to change the attribution, which is pretty sure. And, you know, the Prado's done the same. The research seems absolutely solid. So, yeah.
Great. So I guess to piggyback on that a little bit, Jean is curious, was there a particular art historian, or was there kind of a organization who made the new attribution?
Yes. So the technical analysis that led to the step in which led to the conclusion that the painter was probably German. That was an article that came out maybe a year ago. I can't remember the author's name, but it's in Ars magazine. And then the people who found the document, I can show you right here. So it's a team, and this happens a lot with documentary analysis, because you often get teams of paleographers, Latinists, blah, 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 all working together. So in this case, it's the principal investigator was Carmen Monte Garcia. And I think she's at the University of Zaragoza. So it was Carmen Monte Garcia and her team of 3 other women, I'm now noticing all women, who published this in, actually last year, late last year. Gosh, I said a few months ago. You can see how COVID's killing my brain.
Great. So Alida is curious about the provenance, and if you can discuss that more. Alida, I don't know if you have a more specific question within that, and if so, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to articulate a little bit more.
No, I was just curious as to where we got.
Sure. Okay, so the early stages of the provenance are quite good. So we know who commissioned it, we know all of that. So we know pretty much where it was until the 19th century. Not sure when it actually left Siena, but we know it left Siena before that traveler who was organizing the exhibition in Zaragoza visited Siena, and then published the account of that visit in 1908. So we know the panel was sold by the nuns to someone then. After that, the trail goes completely cold, and it showed up at an auction in Switzerland in, what are we in now, 2020, so like 2015, I think. And it was listed, as these things so often are, as anonymous Italian. The gallery in Madrid called Kailus, who we've worked with quite a bit, bought it at that auction, and did all that conservation and technical analysis. They recognized it when they bought it as being by the Master of Sigena, and then they put it up for sale. They shopped it around to TAFAF, I think, and also TAFAF New York, TAFAF Maastricht. It didn't sell, and then they contacted us, and we bought it. So.
Okay, we have, I think, 3 more questions. This one's probably a little bit shorter. Yolanda is curious about just where X-rays are taken.
Like where on the piece, or where in the? there's specific X-ray equipment that it's the same equipment that you would see in the doctor's office, basically, that is usually part of the equipment in a conservation lab. So, for example, Claire Berry at the Kimball has an infrared camera and an X-ray machine as well. And so you can't shoot the whole piece at once, which is why these are partials and why they're often referred to as mosaics. So basically you shoot, so the infrared camera takes very small shots. So this kind of panel would probably need, 100 different captures or more. The X-rays are usually a little bit bigger. So maybe this one you could get six to 9 X-rays on, and then you use a digital software to stitch them together. And yeah, that's really it. We do still, it's funny, X-rays are funny, but I didn't even know this. I feel guilty, but I just found we have X-rays of our painting of the Sibyl by Velázquez, which I'd never even looked at, that were taken ages ago, but I have the actual films. So it's 4 for that painting, and they're actual films that are like, what is this, 2 feet by 1 foot or something like that. And I'm taking them to the Kimball to have them digitized, but
Great.
It's an X-ray just like your doctor.
And not every museum has a conservation lab, so it's
exactly we don't, which is why I keep referring to the Kimball. Claire Berry's been caring for this collection for a long time, but a lot of labs do. The Prado obviously have a very good X-ray facility, and infrared. They have one of the best infrared cameras in the world. So yeah.
All right, so we have 2 more questions before we wrap up today, and kind of staying on the idea of the kind of physical quality of the work. Terry is really taken by the vibrancy of the color in this work, considering its age.
Yeah.
She has always assumed that there's been some preservation to achieve that. So she's curious about how we can explain that vibrancy and whatever state of preservation it's in.
So the condition of the work is actually quite good. Most of the in painting is fairly limited. So obviously one of the things we do when we assess something for acquisition is we look at it with ultraviolet light. Ultraviolet light lets you see retouching. It phosphoresces, so it kind of shows up as a dark area. This painting does have some losses, and they're in the typical places. So if you're ever looking with your naked eye for losses in a panel painting, look along the seams where the panels are joined together, because for obvious reasons those tend to move and crack. But really this is in good shape. The colors are not overpainted, so those are actually 16th century colors. And I've been reading a lot about color lately, so I'm sort of glad you asked that question. I'm hoping at some point, maybe next year, to do a lecture series on color. And this would be a good poster child for it. By this time, the making of colors had become semi-professionalized. So there were actual people, color men, they were called, who were specialized in making colors. And artists and patrons were both very much aware of the durability of certain pigments, and the non-durability of other pigments. But of course, expense comes into play. So the reds in this case, and I need to go back and check. I think they did some pigment analysis on this painting. And so I need to go back and check. But the reds and the greens are clearly very stable. You can see that. So this may be like a red vermilion. I don't know, I need to check. The lake pigments, which are organic pigments, and like cochineal is one of those, they tend to fade much more, and they kind of come out this kind of pinky color. So these don't look like those, and there doesn't look like there's any kind of lead white mixed in with it either. So it's clearly a very stable pigment. This green as well, it might also be, a lot of the greens historically came from like oxidized copper, basically. So, like when your copper turns green, you scrape that off. More complicated than that, but you get the idea. So these greens are also, I think, fairly stable. But what you notice are the blues, and the blues are the kind of bane of even this. It looks kind of black in this photo, but this is also a blue. And I think these are all azurite. Azurite was like the poor man's ultramarine. Ultramarine was, of course, ridiculously expensive. Oftentimes, the painters themselves couldn't afford it. Oftentimes, the patron, him or herself, had to actually provide the ultramarine. And so, and ultramarine is famous for being really stable. I mean, you can look at, you know, an Italian Renaissance painting now with ultramarine in it, and the blue hasn't really changed. These blues, however, azurite, which is like a friend of copper, basically, it's another stone that was a byproduct of mining, looked almost exactly like ultramarine when you painted it. Like if you put the two next to each other fresh, you might have a hard time telling. But over time, it oxidizes considerably. It's a very fugitive pigment. And so oddly enough, this thing would have been even brighter, but that's why we get these, it's a blue that wants to be green, because remember the copper? So that's sort of what we have here. But the other colors, and the gold, of course, nothing, thank goodness they used gold, not silver, because then it would have been all tarnished. But yeah, they're 16th century colors. And
Lapis lazuli.
Huh?
Lapis lazuli, is that what you're referring to as ultramarine?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so ultramarine is the pigment that's made from lapis lazuli.
Which means across the sea, and that refers to the fact that it was brought in from Afghanistan.
Exactly, yeah. There's wonderful stories about that, and it usually came through Venice, so you see a lot of it used in Venice because they were right there to buy it. But in Spain, you know, the paintings are so big, and the commission's so expensive, you just don't see quite as much of it. So you get a lot of these azurites, and the next time you're in the museum, walk through the Boston gallery, and every time you see this kind of blacky, greeny, bluey stuff, it's probably azurite.
Okay, so we're gonna kind of finish with our last question. Thank you all for staying past, I think, our allotted time. So Vicky is wondering, back to the painting you showed that was somewhat forged, it was overpainted.
Yes.
How common is that for someone to restore, for a forger to restore an old painting?
Let's see, I don't think it's super common, but in this case, it was a very well-known forger. It was someone who had been caught multiple times, and of course I don't remember the name, so I'm sorry, but was particularly known also for doing this. So like, think about how hard it would be to forge something from scratch, right? You have to find 16th century wood, you have to use 16th century materials. It almost next to impossible. Of course, the great Vermeer forger did just that, but it's much easier to take something and make it more sellable. So I don't know if it's super common, but at least for this one character, he was very well known for doing it and making very good money doing it. So it's one of those things that when they analyzed the painting, those red bells went off. Like, oh, okay, it's been overpainted in this particular way. What are the changes that were made? Oh, okay, they changed these columns to make them look more Gothic, so it would look more Flemish. So I don't think it's super common, but one has to be careful. I find a lot of faces that are kind of overpainted. There's a painting in the Getty's collection that is attributed to Fernando Gallego, and the Virgin's face is not attractive by today's standards. But at some point, someone like probably in the 18th or 19th century gave her a very pretty little like Murillo looking face, which just doesn't look right. And of course, once they cleaned it, but I'm sure it made it more sellable because it was pretty. So it's not super common, but it's something that one has to be aware of for sure.
There's going to be a Royal Oak lecture next week called Fakes, Forgeries, and New Discoveries that will be on the Royal Oak Foundation webinar.
Fun.
So, quite, currently a lot of interest in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Amanda, thank you so very much for putting this really wonderful two-part double lecture together for all of us. I do want to just make one last note, which is this painting that's been the object of our attention the last 2 weeks by the Master of Sigena, or Rodrigo de Sajonia, is included in our Alonso Barraguete exhibition, which opens to the public, I believe, this Sunday. So for any of you that are comfortable right now kind of getting out and about, you can always get tickets in advance on the museum's Eventbrite page. Come check out the exhibition and also get a closer look at this work in person. So thank you all.
And keep in mind, they may have known each other because Barraguete was in Zaragoza at exactly the same time that Charles V was there and when this was being made. So all connected.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much. Make sure to watch our YouTube page in the next week or so, so that you can watch this and our first lecture again.
Thank you.